Hello, everybody. It's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Thursday, the 7th of October, 2021. Click on the notification, click on the subscriber button in the lower right here to subscribe to my show, and also click on the notification bell in the upper right to be notified. And I'm going to go ahead and get started now with the topic today, which is Robert E. Lee and Facebook. After Lee's statue on Richmond's Monument Avenue was removed last month, Carl Jones, an officer in the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, wrote a 3-paragraph Facebook post defending Lee's reputation. It's on his September 11th, 2021 Facebook page if you want to look for it. And it's also on some other pages, including the Facebook group called The Civil War Buff. You'll find it there. Unfortunately, the so-called Facebook fact checker insists on overlaying Carl's post with a big warning banner stating that it is, quote, missing contact, close quote, and could thereby misinform readers. This warning banner gets automatically overlaid anywhere Carl's post is shared on Facebook. So what you can do is you can click on the overlay banner and choose if you want to read their analysis of what's wrong with Carl's 3-paragraph post. Essentially, as we kind of suspected for a long time, Facebook has become our thought police, and now they're focusing in on the Civil War. Now, the fact checker in this case is probably correct in disputing Carl's claim that Lee, quote, educated, close quote, the Arlington slaves. Perhaps Carl was thinking of Booker T. Washington's assertion that Lee educated them during Sunday school and other church services. However, even though Washington was a Virginia slave, he was owned by another family and was only 9 years old when the war ended. Thus, his statement seems like it's probably hearsay. Nonetheless, the Facebook fact checker uses that point to spring dive into derogatory and dubious claims about Lee's relationships to slaves and slavery. Yet her own claims lack context, and one of them is an unqualified error. First, she falsely represents as fact that Lee physically punished runaway slaves. She cites an incident involving 3 slaves that were part of his father's estate. And incidentally, this is the only incident that involves even a hint of Lee whipping slaves. So when Lee's father-in-law died, Lee was made executor of the heavily indebted estate, which included Arlington House there across the Potomac River from Washington. Lee was charged with conflicting responsibilities in the execution of that estate, such as providing a cash legacy for each of his daughters, who were the granddaughters of his father-in-law, and a separate requirement to free all of the slaves within 5 years. Lee met all of those responsibilities. He kept the slaves working for 5 years, it is true, but that was to reduce the debts of the estate and to provide the cash legacies for the granddaughters of his father-in-law, meaning his daughters. Now, all of these slaves were set free within that time limit, even though it was the middle of the war between the states. The fact checker's sole incident involves a slave named Wesley Morris, who claimed that Lee had Norris and 2 accompanying runaways whipped. Norris further claimed that Lee whipped one, a female slave, himself. Now, the checker does not report that Lee denied this accusation indignantly. Instead, she cites historian John Reeves as saying, quote, every one of the facts in Wesley Norris's account has been shown to be true, close quote. The content of Reeves's quote is a falsehood. I don't know whether it's a deliberate falsehood or just a sloppy one, but it is false. Nobody but Norris ever claimed to witness the incident. The sister of one of the alleged victims even stayed friendly with Lee after the end of the war. Second, the fact checker proceeds to itemize Lee's slave ownership before he was involved in the Arlington estate. One of her sources says that Lee, quote, may have had one or two slaves of his own, which he may have sold, close quote. Another source states that he had inherited 3 or 4 slave families after his mother died. Now, this checker does not report that the general's son, Robert Jr., said that his dad owned no slaves as late as the 1850s. And historian Alfred X states, quote, there is no evidence that Lee ever bought or sold a slave. Third, the checker also fails to mention that in January 1865, Lee urged that the Confederate Congress permit slaves to be enlisted as soldiers in his army and other Confederate armies. Moreover, he urged that they be granted freedom for their service, to be followed by a general emancipation of all slaves in the Confederacy. Many of the units in his armies quickly took a vote endorsing the proposition. Eventually, Congress authorized the enlistment of up to 300,000 blacks. President Jefferson Davis stipulated that each must be a volunteer and accompanied by his manumission papers. That means that each of the soldiers that Davis wanted would have to be a volunteer and not forced into it. And secondly, that he would be free, a free black. Of course, the war ended soon thereafter. Now, while most, that meaning anti-Southern, historians dismissed the proposal as an act of desperation late in the war, they do not consider that Lincoln's own Emancipation Proclamation was also a desperate act. He adopted it as an act of war in hopes of turning the tide, which in the all-important Eastern Theater was running against the Union at that time. Lincoln later wrote about his mid-July 1862 motives when he settled upon emancipation. Quote, things had gone from bad to worse until I felt we had reached the end of our rope, that we had about played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game. I now determined upon the adoption of the emancipation policy, close quote. In other words, Lincoln was just as desperate when he approved that Emancipation Proclamation. Yet the fact checker ignores or fails to even look for that kind of context. Oh no, we can't do that. If historians are going to give Lincoln credit for adopting emancipation as a last resort, then they should let Lee, why should they not then let Lee and Davis get the same kind of credit? But they don't, not the ones that we have in the academy now. So let me share with you something that I think can move this conversation along. This is my book, Trading with the Enemy. It's $26. If you'd like to get an autographed copy, it's $29. But you got to email me, Phil, PHIL _ Lee, LEIGH @me.com. If you're here in the United States, I'll cover the postage to get it to you. Now, what this is about is a story that most academic historians today don't want to tell because it reflects poorly on the Union as well as the South, because it involves trading with the enemy. And here's the key: 2/3 of the cotton that left the Confederacy during the war went across the battle lines to the north. The northern cotton speculators paid sometimes gold for it, sometimes greenbacks, but the money enabled the Confederacy to buy weapons. One Rhode Island senator was even involved in a proposition, not only just a proposition, but an action to provide the Confederacy with weapons in exchange for cotton. If you want to get some of the story about the war between the states that you're not going to get from the academic historians, and Give this one a try. Okay. All right. That's our show for today. Come back again. I look forward to seeing you. Have a good day.